Hello, everyone, and good morning. Thanks for joining us today for Sutta study with Bhante Suddhaso. So today we'll be looking at the Sutta on wealth. So as usual, Bhante will read through and explain the Sutta. And if you have questions at any time, feel free to type them into the live chat, and he'll address them at the end of the talk. So good morning so far to Gita and Jana, Jens, and Michael. So good to see you all. And at this time, I'll pass things over to Bhante Suddhaso.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. Good morning, friends. So today we'll be going through another sutta. This sutta is called the Dhana Sutta, which means wealth, discourse on wealth. It's from Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 5, sutta number 47. As usual, I'll read through the sutta and give some explanations as we go along, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. This is a fairly short sutta. Actually quite short sutta. So we'll see how this goes. It might not take that much time to get through this. And then we'll have time for your questions. So the sutta begins. Now, this is presumably the Buddha speaking. Monks, there are 5 kinds of wealth. What 5? Faith wealth, morality wealth, information wealth, generosity wealth, and wisdom wealth. Monks, what is faith wealth? Here, monks, a disciple of the noble has faith. He has faith in the Tathagata's awakening. He is the fortunate one, the worthy one, the fully self-awakened one. He has perfect knowledge and behavior. He is the sublime one, the world knower, the unsurpassable trainer of trainable people, the teacher of angels and humans, the awakened one, the fortunate one. Monks, this is called faith wealth. So this is the first of the 5 kinds of wealth, which is faith. Again, here in the sutta, the Buddha is talking about 5 kinds of wealth. And when the Buddha is talking about wealth, he's not talking about money or property, which is what we normally associate with the word wealth, but rather he's talking about possessing something which is truly valuable, possessing something which is truly important. So from a Buddhist standpoint, things like money and property and so on are not of much significance. They're only really significant to the extent that they help us do good things. So there are other suttas where the Buddha does talk about the proper use of ordinary wealth, the proper use of money and property and possessions. And he says that the proper use of money and possessions is to, 1, keep yourself healthy, 2, to look after your family, to properly support your family and your friends, to support society, so donating to charity and supporting the good works in one's community, and to make offerings to spiritual professionals, so to monastics and priests of whatever spiritual practices one is into. And he talks about the proper ways of accumulating wealth versus improper or unwholesome ways of accumulating wealth and so on. But this is not what the Buddha is talking about here. So here the Buddha is not talking about physical wealth. He's not talking about money and so on. But rather he's talking about accumulating valuable qualities of body, speech, and mind. So the first one that he mentions is faith. And this is important because one of the bits of rhetoric that you'll commonly hear especially in Western Buddhism in the last 100 years, As you'll hear the statement that there's no such thing as faith in Buddhism, that Buddhism does not involve faith or rely on faith. And that's not quite true. There's an element of truth to that, but it's not quite true. Now, the reason I say there's an element of truth to it is because ultimately Buddhism relies upon direct experience, a direct experience of the Four Noble Truths, a direct experience of the truth of the Buddha's words. But the Buddha also talks about having faith, and here he's emphasizing in particular having faith in the enlightenment of the Buddha, having faith that the Buddha was in fact a fully enlightened being. And it gives the list of the 9 qualities of a Buddha. This is a commonly found list. In Theravada monasteries, this is commonly chanted every day. So having faith that the Buddha was fully enlightened and that he had these 9 praiseworthy qualities, perfect knowledge and behavior, knower of the worlds, the unsurpassable trainer, and so on. So this is extremely important for our practice, because if we have faith that the Buddha was enlightened, then we will take his teachings seriously. And we will practice sincerely in line with his teachings. And this also means that we will have faith in our own capacity to attain awakening, because that was one of the things that the Buddha taught over and over again, was that every single one of us, regardless of gender, nationality, sexual orientation, age, etc., is capable of attaining awakening, just as he did. So this quality of faith in the Buddha is a very important foundational principle for our practice. And not trying to second guess the Buddha, not trying to outsmart the Buddha. So there's been a lot of revisionist movements in Buddhism, again, particularly in Western Buddhism in the past few decades. Revisionist movements, attempts to reconstruct a more original, authentic Buddhism, and in so doing to discard 2,500 years of Buddhist tradition, which is all built upon the Buddha's teachings, all built upon the principles of the Dhamma. And this all gets quite risky. It gets quite risky because we're placing ourselves above the Buddha. We're placing our own limited understanding and limited wisdom above the Buddha. So it's important to start with this recognition. The Buddha was fully enlightened. We are not. The Buddha was the perfect teacher. So we should pay attention to what he taught. We should try to understand the Dhamma with a mind of humility and genuine interest. So this forms the basis for sincere practice. The flip side of this is that someone who does not have faith that the Buddha was enlightened, who lacks confidence in the Buddha and in the Buddha's teachings, well, they tend to approach the Dhamma with a cherry-picking attitude, picking out the bits that they like, discarding everything that they don't like, practicing half-heartedly, because there's a lot of other things you can do with your life that get much more quick results, much more pleasant, immediate results. Whereas Dhamma practice takes a lot of patience and persistence and renunciation. So without sincere faith, all of that patience, persistence, and renunciation is difficult to value. It's difficult to see the point in it. So starting with faith in the enlightenment of the Buddha, and then from the faith in the enlightenment of the Buddha, then the path becomes much easier and much more potent and much clearer. So that's the first one. So faith, and the wealth of having faith in the awakening of the Buddha. The second one he lists, he says, monks, what is morality wealth? He says, here, monks, a disciple of the noble refrains from killing living beings, from taking what is not given, from sexual misconduct, from false speech, and from alcohol and other intoxicants, that cause negligence. Monks, this is called morality wealth. First off, I'd like to point out a minor translation thing, which comes up in many places in the suttas, which is the word Arya Savaka. So the word Arya Savaka has two parts. Arya means noble, and Arya commonly refers to awakened beings, people who are at least stream enterers. It also refers to the noble truths. So the Four Noble Truths are called the Arya Satcha, the Arya truths, the noble truths. And Savaka literally means listener. So one who listens or pays attention. So it's commonly translated disciple. So Arya Savaka, there's different ways of translating this word compound. You'll commonly see it translated as noble disciple. But another way of translating it is disciple of the nobles, disciple of the noble ones. And given how the Buddha uses the term Arya Savaka, in my opinion, the meaning is the second. So a disciple of the noble ones. So Arya Savaka means somebody who listens to and pays attention to awakened beings, who tries to learn and follow the instructions of awakened beings. So not necessarily a disciple who is already awakened themselves. And this distinction is quite clear. So I've encountered some people over the years who try to make the argument that anywhere in the suttas where the Buddha talks about an Arya Savaka, that his instructions apply only to stream enterers and up. And if you're not a stream enterer, then you shouldn't pay attention. I've even heard people say that, for example, the Loving Kindness Sutta is directed at Arya Savakas and therefore is not of any import to the rest of us. So taking Arya Savaka to mean only stream enterers and above doesn't fit with how the Buddha uses this word throughout the suttas. So instead, as far as I can tell, the word Arya Savaka means disciple of the nobles, rather than noble disciple. It's one who is trying to learn from awakened beings and follow their path. So morality, the wealth of morality is to refrain from killing living beings, from taking what is not given, from sexual misconduct, from false speech, and from using intoxicants that cause negligence. So this should be familiar to anyone who has some experience with Buddhism. This is the 5 precepts. So the 5 precepts is the basic foundation of a Buddhist life. And it's important to really take the commitment to these 5 precepts seriously. So not killing living beings, not killing any living beings. Yesterday, somebody had asked about animal farmers, saying, well, animal farmers might be killing living beings, but they're also doing something good for society. And it's like, well, maybe that's true that they're doing something helpful for society, but that doesn't change the fact that they're killing living beings. And even the most ethical animal farms are still not particularly nice places for animals to live at. So taking this seriously, not killing living beings. So not killing humans, animals, insects, spirits. If you have the ability to kill spirits, don't kill spirits either. But rather cultivating an attitude of compassion and respect for all sentient beings. Not taking what isn't given, so not stealing, not depriving other people of their possessions. But there's an added layer to this. So not taking what is not given also means that if you're not sure that something is rightfully yours for the taking, then not to take it. So, for example, if you see something lying on the counter and you're not sure that it's okay for you to appropriate it, then leave it there. If it hasn't been offered, then it hasn't been offered. If it hasn't been given to you, if it hasn't been made clear that you can take it if you want it, then let it be until you get permission, until you get clarity that it's available. Refraining from sexual misconduct. So that's any kind of harmful sexual behavior. And the main examples of this are infidelity and sexual assault. So we refrain from infidelity, so either cheating on our own partner or getting with somebody who's already in a committed relationship. So refraining from infidelity and from sexual assault. Again, it's worth pointing out that in Buddhism, sexual misconduct does not make any reference whatsoever to the relative genders of the people involved. So Buddhism does not condemn any kind of non-hetero behaviors. So Buddhism, or to put it in more clear terms, Buddhism does not mandate heterosexuality, nor does it condemn anything outside of heterosexuality. So in this, Buddhism is actually quite open and tolerant within the sexual domain, as long as one is observing the boundaries of trust. So observing boundaries of trust, which includes, as I mentioned, refraining from infidelity and sexual assault. Refraining from false speech, so not telling deliberate lies. And in the Noble Eightfold Path, the Buddha also mentions 3 other forms of proper speech. So besides not telling deliberate lies, there's also not engaging in divisive speech, so not using speech in order to sow discord and disharmony between people. Not engaging in harsh speech, so instead speaking gently, kindly, considerately. And also not engaging in useless speech, idle chatter. So not rambling on and on about useless things which aren't of any benefit to the people involved. But of these, the Buddha singles out false speech as being the most important, the most critical, which is why it's included in the 5 precepts. So in Buddhist practice, we are committed to realizing truth. We are committed to coming to a direct, deep understanding of truth. So if one understands the principles of karma, that everything we do comes back to us, then we realize that to lead others away from the truth, to intentionally deceive others, to lie to others, means that we will be led away from the truth ourselves. We will be deceived. We will be lied to. And that will be an impediment on our path to awakening. And finally, the 5th one, which is the precept that everyone likes to pretend doesn't exist, but bad news, it actually does exist. It's kind of a running joke at Abhayagiri, the monastery I did most of my training at. People like to take the 4 precepts, by which we meant people like to take the first 4 and not the one about alcohol and intoxicants. But this is really important. So the Buddha is emphasizing here intoxicants that cause negligence. And he singles out alcohol as the prime example. When the mind is affected by alcohol, then one's mindfulness is weak, one's samadhi is weak, one's self-restraint is weak, one's wisdom is weak. So it diminishes all of the wholesome qualities of mind that we're trying to cultivate. It's a really interesting experience, by the way. If you've never done this, I recommend it. Go to a party where people are drinking a lot of alcohol, but remain completely sober the entire time. Don't have even a single drop. Be completely sober. And what you'll notice is that as the night wears on, everybody else gets just dumber and dumber and dumber. They just say the stupidest things. They get really self-centered and conceited. They become arrogant and foolish and reckless. They do dumb things. They say dumb things. And you can just watch. You can watch how people willingly degrade their own minds to animalistic levels, actually sub-animalistic levels. I mean, the monastery cat is more well-behaved than the average drunkard. So, by the way, if you have self-restraint problems, don't go to parties at all, just to be clear on this. So this is only advice that's worth following if you have the good enough self-restraint to not fall into the misbehavior that you see going on around you. And actually, you only really need to do this once, and then the lesson will be learned. So in my case, about once every few years, I get invited to a wedding or a funeral or one of these family things that you can't really say no to. And I go there, and of course, everybody else is getting drunk, and I'm just observing as their IQ and wisdom gets lower and lower and lower as the night goes on. And it gives me joy in the fact that I don't do that to myself. It gives me joy in the fact that I am committed to mindfulness, to self-restraint, to consideration, to stability of mind. So the Buddha says that one who follows these 5 precepts has a kind of wealth related to that. So morality wealth. So this is just like being rich, being wealthy. It's like having a lot of money in the bank. So having a strong commitment to morality is one of these 5 forms of true wealth. And one thing I should point out, every now and then people get a little bit irritated about how us monks are always talking about morality. But the truth is, it only irritates you if you're not committed to morality. Those who are committed to morality, when they hear talk on morality, they get joyful. There's another sutta where the Buddha says exactly that, actually. The Buddha says, those who are moral, when they hear talk on morality, are uplifted. Those who are wise, when they hear talk about wisdom, they're uplifted. Those who have good samadhi, when they hear talk about samadhi, they're uplifted. Those who have bad morality, when they hear talk about morality, they get angry. Those who have bad wisdom, those who are foolish, when they hear talk about wisdom, they get angry. And those who have bad samadhi, when they hear talk about samadhi, they get angry. So I find this really interesting, that the Buddha is pointing out this connection here. So if you're irritated by this talk about morality, then that probably means you need to reflect on your own morality. And me saying that will make you even more angry, but it's my duty. So the next one, and this is one I find very interesting as well. He says, monks, what is information wealth? Here, monks, a disciple of the noble has a lot of information, retains information, and accumulates information about those teachings which are good in the middle. Good in the beginning. Skipped over the beginning. About those teachings which are good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in their conclusion, with the right meaning and phrasing, which proclaim the completely thorough and pure spiritual life. These are the kinds of teachings which he retains a lot of information about, which he has recited verbally, examined mentally, and well penetrated with right view. Monks, this is called information wealth. So these days we have a lot of easy access to information. So with internet and smartphones, you can easily access just about the entire body of human knowledge that's been preserved for thousands of years, since before we even had books. And so what kind of information is valuable? So the Buddha says, yeah, having a lot of information is one form of wealth. But true wealth is having a lot of information about the Dhamma. So it's learning a lot of Dhamma, retaining knowledge of the Dhamma. And I find it really interesting. He says accumulating, so stockpiling Dhamma. So not just having a little bit, but stockpiling Dhamma, accumulating a vast hoard of Dhamma in your mind. And not just accumulating a vast stockpile of Dhamma in your mind, but also, he says, recite it verbally, In other words, talk about it, chant it. So in monasteries, we commonly chant every day. And what we're chanting is selections from the Buddha's teachings, selections of Dhamma. And examine it mentally. So again, it's not enough just to stuff some facts in your head, but you also need to examine. So mentally consider and think about and reflect upon the Dhamma. Try to come to some deeper understanding of it, which is what he means by the next statement, which is well penetrated with right view. So we're not just trying to accumulate knowledge, but we're also trying to come to a deep, profound realization of the underlying meaning of the Dhamma. So one of the ways we do that is through constantly reflecting on the Dhamma and through trying to see its applicability to our life, trying to see how it manifests in our life. So again, it's worth pointing out once again that what the Buddha is emphasizing here is the teachings which proclaim the completely thorough and pure spiritual life. In other words, information which leads to awakening, information about the path to enlightenment, how to live a life which leads to awakening. That's the kind of information that's worth accumulating. So not necessarily information about carburetors or the political situation in Chile or whatever. Like that's kind of beside the point. Probably there might be some relationship there that might be relevant under certain circumstances. But generally speaking, that's not what he's talking about. He's not talking about studying the nature of quarks. He's not talking about just accumulating worldly information. He's talking about accumulating knowledge of the Dhamma and of deeply examining and considering the Dhamma. That's the kind of information accumulation which is a form of true wealth. And this stands in contrast to the teaching which is found in some Buddhist traditions. So in particular in the Zen schools and also in some branches of the Theravada forest traditions. There's this teaching to close the books, don't collect facts, just read your heart and wisdom will arise. And it's interesting that the Buddha actually says the opposite in many places in the suttas. In many places in the suttas, he emphasizes the value of accumulating a lot of knowledge about the Dhamma, making an effort to stockpile the suttas in your mind, and to constantly reflect on and consider their meaning. So we need to be careful not to take those teachings about close the books and read your heart, not to take those out of context. Not to skip the fact that before you can close the books, you have to have already opened the books. So reading your heart is another way of saying that we need to see the Dhamma in ourselves. We need to see the Dhamma in our life. So again, we're not learning the Dhamma. We're not accumulating knowledge of the Dhamma so that we can pass tests and exams, or so that we can win in arguments on Facebook. We're accumulating knowledge about the Dhamma so that we can see the truth of the Dhamma in our own hearts, which is what's being pointed to in these statements in the Zen traditions and forest traditions of close the books and read your heart. That's what they're saying. They're saying, don't let the Dhamma just be intellectual information. See its applicability and reality in your own experience. That's what they're talking about. And the fourth one, the Buddha says, monks, what is generosity wealth? Here, monks, the disciple of the noble is free of the stain of stinginess. He lives at home with the generosity of release, open-handed. Wait, let me look at the Pali here. He lives at home with, the generosity of release, open-handed, enjoying relinquishment, enjoying donating, enjoying giving and sharing. Monks, this is called generosity wealth. So this is another critical element of Buddhist practice. And in fact, in traditional Buddhism, generosity is usually the first thing that's taught. Often, even before a child is old enough to walk, they're already teaching the child how to be generous. So they'll put something in the child's hands and they'll guide the child's hands towards a monk and make the child give something to the monk. And then they'll praise the child and the child gets happy. So even before the age of 3, so often when a child is just 1 or 2 years old, they're already teaching them generosity and the joy of giving things, the joy of donating and sharing with others. And then as they get older, then the child is taught the 5 precepts. And then maybe when they get older, if the parents have some knowledge of meditation practice, then they might start teaching their child samadhi and introducing them to the wisdom teachings. And this is the progression that we see in the suttas. So starting with generosity, cultivating morality, then the mind is ready for practicing samadhi and cultivating wisdom. So generosity. So first off, free of the stain of stinginess. I find this turn of phrase quite lovely. So the Buddha talks about stinginess as a stain on the mind. So it's just like if you have a beautiful white garment and it's got a big ugly stain on it. There's something clearly disturbing there. Nobody wants to wear it. It's not something that you're proud of. But then you carefully wash that garment and you get the stain out. And then you have something shining and bright and pure, which you're proud of, which brings joy to the mind of both yourself and everyone who sees it. So in the same way, we examine our own mind and we see, is there any stinginess? Am I hesitant to give things to others? Am I hesitant to share what I have with others? Am I hesitant to do kind things for others? If so, then we're still stained with the stain of stinginess. And that's something which we need to work on cleaning from the mind. We need to work on cultivating a mind of open-handed generosity. So he talks about the generosity of release. So release is letting go. In order to be generous, you have to be willing to let go of things, to let go of your possessions, let go of your time, let go of your energy, because you're giving it to others for the benefit of others. So open-handed, again, the sense of like we don't have this tight fist, but rather an open hand, which is always willing to share what we have. Enjoying relinquishment. So noticing the happiness that comes when we relinquish things, the happiness that comes with letting go of things. By contrast, the mind of attachment and clinging and grasping, notice how unpleasant that is, how uncomfortable it is. Enjoying donating, enjoying giving and sharing. So drawing attention to the pleasure that comes from donating, giving, and sharing. Noticing the happiness and goodness that brings into other people's lives. And not turning away from that, but rather always inclining the mind towards an ever deeper appreciation of the happiness that comes from giving and sharing with others. So this also, the Buddha says, is a form of wealth. And again, this is a bit different from how we normally talk about wealth. Normally you think wealth means accumulating things for yourself and holding on to them. But the Buddha says, actually, this form of wealth is when you give away what you have to others. So when you give away physical wealth, then you accumulate spiritual wealth, which is what's truly valuable. And finally, the 5th kind of wealth, he says, monks, what is wisdom wealth? Here, monks, a disciple of the noble is wise, has the wisdom which knows arising and vanishing, which leads to a breakthrough to nobility and to the proper elimination of suffering. Monks, this is called wisdom wealth. So this is the fifth and highest form of wealth, which is the wealth of wisdom. And here the Buddha starts by emphasizing in particular the wisdom which knows arising and vanishing, the wisdom which knows the appearing and disappearing of phenomena, which is talking about the recognition of impermanence, the recognition of emptiness, the recognition of the constant manifesting and vanishing of phenomena moment by moment. Noticing how things come into being and then immediately cease to exist every single moment. So noticing the insubstantiality of all things, the emptiness of all things, the lack of inherent existence of all things. So this kind of mind, the Buddha says, causes a breakthrough to nobility, which is a way of saying attaining awakening, attaining some stage of awakening, and to the proper elimination of suffering. So when we see the insubstantiality, impermanence, and emptiness of all things, then we become impermeable to suffering. Dukkha has no hold on the mind. There's nowhere for it to land. We've seen that every single thing which could be dukkha is insubstantial and therefore cannot be dukkha for us. So this is the highest form of wealth, which is the wealth of wisdom. Then the Buddha ends with a short verse, as is common in the shorter suttas. Many of them end with a short poem. So this is translated, and of course when you translate poetry, it loses much of its poetic flair, but the meaning still comes across. He says, monks, he ends the sutta with saying, monks, these are the 5 kinds of wealth. And then the poem says, one whose faith in the Tathagata is unshakable and well established, who has the good morality which is loved and praised by the noble, who has confidence in the Sangha and who sees properly. That one is said to not be destitute. Their life is not meaningless. Therefore, a wise person commits to faith, morality, confidence, seeing the Dhamma, and remembering the instructions of the Buddhas. It's a very short, beautiful verse to wrap up the sutta. So first off, he points out that somebody who has these 5 kinds of wealth is said to not be destitute. They're not poor. Even if they don't have much money or wealth or property in the ordinary sense, they're not poor because they have something valuable. And also he says their life is not meaningless. So recently, a few times people have asked, how can we make our lives meaningful? How can we bring meaning into our lives? And the Buddha says right here, cultivate these 5 kinds of wealth. So faith in the Buddha's awakening, follow the 5 precepts, learn the Dhamma and examine it, practice giving and sharing and generosity, and cultivate the wisdom which knows the impermanence of all things. He says if you do these 5 things, then your life is not meaningless. On the contrary, your life is rich, vital, meaningful. So that's the end of this sutta. So again, a relatively short and lovely discourse. So at this time, if you have any questions or comments, please go ahead and enter them in, and I'll answer as best I can. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhante. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And there's a couple questions so far. So Michael asks, would you kindly be more specific about the revisionist Western Buddhism you were referring to? I think perhaps there are many versions and levels of this. The devil might be in the details. Is it belief in the Buddha's awakening and unseen realms and rebirth and our ability to be awakened?
I actually think that's a topic on its own. It might be something that's worth spending a whole segment on. But briefly speaking, I would just say that it boils down to starting with, once again, faith in the awakening of the Buddha and faith in the Dhamma. And then the next thing is to, again, accumulate a lot of knowledge about the Dhamma, and to really carefully examine it. But it's important to make sure that we're examining it with a humble mind, that we're not trying to superimpose our own beliefs onto the Dhamma, that we're not filtering the Dhamma through our own pre-existing opinions or through our own conditioning. And this can be quite challenging because often we don't see our own conditioning. We don't see our own pre-existing opinions. So the truth is that when we approach the Dhamma, our tendency is going to be to filter it and rewrite it based upon our pre-existing beliefs and opinions. And we may not even realize that's what we're doing. So this is where revisionist Buddhism gets really, really dangerous, is because it tends to mean revising it to match our pre-existing opinions, which are probably not in line with the Dhamma. So this is what we really need to watch out for. So if you're not confident that you have a clear and precise enough understanding of your own internal biases, then it's better not to try to revise the Dhamma. It's better just to go by what's in the books. It's better to really carefully examine the suttas and to discuss their contents with senior teachers, monks who have a deep understanding, both intellectually and experientially, of the Dhamma. Otherwise, again, we're just going to wind up writing in our own views and opinions. And there's countless examples of this. One major example of this actually is the surprisingly common viewpoint among Western practitioners of Buddhism, that you only live once. It's like, well, where did that come from? Well, it comes from our own cultural conditioning. Comes from our pre-existing opinions. It doesn't have anything to do with the Dhamma. It's just superimposing our own pre-existing beliefs on top of the Dhamma, filtering the Dhamma through our own pre-existing opinions. That's not so useful. In fact, it's not useful at all. So that's what we need to watch out for. Anyway, I could say a lot more on the subject, but I think that it's better off as a topic on its own. Okay.
And Michael's next question was, is the monastery vegetarian for the most part and not condoning the killing of animals by eating them, thus keeping the industry going?
Correct. Yes, this monastery is officially vegetarian. And the reason for that is, in fact, out of compassion for all sentient beings. So it's also worth pointing out, by the way, that it's not just good for animals, but it's also good for humans. In that mass animal farming is one of the major contributors to climate catastrophe. So by practicing a vegetarian diet, you're also helping to preserve the environment for all the humans that live here, as well as, of course, preventing the ongoing holocaust of animals, which is going on at nightmarish quantities. It's just mind-blowing. So the average American eats meat every day. So the sheer number of sentient beings that have to be tortured and killed on a daily basis in order to feed that insatiable appetite for meat. 300 million people eating meat every day. Do you realize how many sentient beings are killed to sustain that? It's mind-boggling, and it's completely unnecessary. Completely unnecessary. 99% of humans can get by perfectly healthy on a vegetarian diet. So there's no need to be killing animals for meat. It's completely unnecessary. Okay.
And hello, Melody, who says she was late because her brother came home from the military. So that must have been a good moment for you all. And then Jens has a question. Can you speak on using the reflection of our personal development of wealth in our meditation?
Yeah, so that's what the Buddha calls silanusati. So recollection on your own goodness. So in meditation practice, there is value to bringing to mind your own goodness, especially if you have low self-esteem problems. Recollect your own morality, recollect your own generosity, recollect the Dhamma, what you've learned of the Dhamma, or just recollect the fact that you've learned the Dhamma in the first place. Recollect the Buddha, the fact that there was an awakened being and you have the great fortune to know about the Buddha, the great fortune to have access to his teachings. So these kinds of thoughts are incredibly wholesome. They bring a lot of happiness and joy to the mind. And they also lead to us having a deep appreciation for this life. A deep appreciation for this life when we have the opportunity to cultivate spiritual wealth and practice the path to awakening. Okay.
And Binaural Dean is also joining us, who says peace and love from Florida. Good to see you. And then the final question so far is also from Michael, who says, do you chant in English? I would think that chanting for information wealth, would require our native language.
Or you can learn Pali. I like to chant in Pali. One, I know Pali, so that makes it a lot easier. Two, it's beautiful. So the chants that we use, most of them are more than 2,000 years old. These very ancient Pali teachings, very ancient Pali chants, which are really beautiful to chant. They're designed to be easy to recite. They're designed to flow together harmoniously. So that's quite beautiful. And there's also a sense of connection to an ancient tradition, which is also quite lovely. But we also do chant some things in English from time to time. Because there is also, as you say, there is some value to reciting the Dhamma in your native language, because it has a way of infiltrating the mind, which even if you're fluent in a second or third language, it tends to be a bit more powerful when you recite something in your native language.
All right, and that seems to be the last comment and question of the morning. So we have one from the live audience.
Yes, Antoinette, go ahead.
Okay, so in Christianity, the giving is mathematically specified at 10%, the tithes. And so I was wondering if in Buddhism there's any mathematical mandate or there's a preference for what generosity, like the form it should come in.
No, so Antoinette was asking, is there a mathematical requirement such as 10% that you're supposed to give? And the answer is no. The encouragement is to be open-handed, to be generous, but there's no specific number or amount. So it's something which you just look at your own mind, and are you being stingy? If so, then be more generous. And it's delighting in generosity. So that's very different from a sense of obligation. Like, oh no, I've only been giving 9%. I need to ratchet it up a little bit because that's my duty. Well, that's not joyful. There's no joy in that. But instead, it's setting aside the numbers and just seeing, what do I have that I can share with others? What do I have that I can give to others? And being delighted, it's like, yes, I have an opportunity to give something. I have an opportunity to help other people. How wonderful. I'm going to take this opportunity. And maybe you wind up giving more than 10%, and that's okay. In fact, that's great. The truth is that we need very little to get by. Everything else is extra and can be shared with others. Okay? And she has another question, yes?
Well, two questions. One is, or two more. One is that generosity, how I grew up with it, was that it was tied to one's demonstration of how much they trust or faith. And so, what does generosity show, or how does it get translated in Buddhism? And the other is that my perspective on generosity and how I grew up was that it's very transactional. The translation of tithes is the promise to come. So, like, people give tithes with the expectation that God will then bless them from what they give. They don't voice that, but that's a translation. So, is there?
So, advance warning: if you ask 2 questions, I will only remember the second one.
Okay. I'll go back to the first. The first was that generosity tends to be tied to how much someone has faith or how much they trust. Is generosity tied to anything, or what does it translate into, or what does it show?
So she's asking, is generosity tied to something? And I would say that ultimately it's tied to 2 things. It's tied to your degree of compassion and your degree of non-attachment. If you don't care about others, then you won't give. And if you're attached to your own things, then you won't give. But if you care about others and you're not attached to your possessions, then generosity will flow freely. There'll be no obstacles to it in your mind. And your second thing was asking about if generosity is transactional. Yeah.
Or how does someone not get stuck in that mindset of it being transactional?
I would say to keep from getting stuck in the mind of transaction is just to focus on the joy that you're bringing to the other people. Rather than thinking, I am giving this because I want to be the recipient of good karma, instead think, I am doing this because it makes that person happy. That's it, end of story. You could also think, I am doing this because it's part of the path that the Buddha taught. That's also acceptable because it's reflecting back on your faith in the Buddha. But the cleanest and simplest way is just to reflect. I am doing this because it makes this other person happy. And just delight in their happiness. Delight in the good fortune you're bringing to others. And this is actually the highest form of giving, is when you do it purely because it brings happiness to others. Purely because this is the path to awakening, path of goodness. And the truth is, you'll still get good karma from it anyway. So you don't need to worry about that. That comes anyway. But if you focus on the goodness of the act and the goodness it brings to others, then that also helps to purify your mind. Okay.
And Denise Guzman from New York says, although I don't see charitable donations as a duty, I still make sure that there is a line for it in my monthly budget. That way I give myself the opportunity to be generous.
Yeah, and that's important. So it's important to look at your own mind and just to see what skillful methods can I use to remind myself to be good and to do good things. So for some people, it actually is helpful to set aside a certain amount in their budget for charity, for donations, because otherwise some people, they forget. And then they wind up using up all of their money and they don't have anything left over because it just never occurred to them. But it's also important then to remind ourselves to always look for opportunities to be generous. Because actually there's opportunities all the time. Always look for opportunities to be generous. So if setting it aside in your budget is a way of reminding yourself to be generous, then that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. Whatever works.
And Liz asks, what about giving because it makes oneself happy as opposed to giving to make others happy?
That's also perfectly fine. So that's what the Buddha said here, enjoying donating. Enjoying giving and sharing. So that's also that you yourself find joy in the act of giving. Yeah.
Okay. All right, so it seems like that's the final comment and question of the morning. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And you can return at 7:30 p.m. tonight for Monk Chat with a panel of monastics here at Empty Cloud. And we'll see you then. So we can end with 3 sadhus.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
And enjoy the rest of your day.